Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and I haven't made a video in a while, so I thought I'd put another one up. Also, I find myself with a little bit of spare time recently. I'm actually in the process of looking for a new job, so please be praying with me on that front. I've filled out about 20 applications so far, and I have an interview next week, but hopefully all that will work out. But in the meantime, I have a little bit of extra time, and so I thought I'd do some of these things. Also, with my spare time, I've decided to get into writing another book. When I looked through some of the material that I've written before, I found it to be a little bit lacking. For example, a while back I put out a book called Foundation, and at the time I really liked it. It was a nice summary of a lot of fundamental things that especially Protestants believe. But at the same time, it didn't really address a lot of issues. It didn't go into a whole lot of detail or really explain anything usefully, unfortunately. And so I'm writing another book called Principles, and it's specifically Principles of Biblical Historical Christianity, or I'm going to go through in a bit more detail and explain what a lot of the different fundamental beliefs actually mean and that sort of thing. But the reason why I'm making this video today is not because of all that other stuff, all of those fundamental beliefs and explaining them, but because of the first chapter of the book. That is, when I set about making the book, I went through and said, okay, what are the fundamentals of biblical historical Christianity, of basic Protestantism, explaining those kinds of things. But the nagging question is always, why Protestantism? Why be a biblical historical Christian instead of something else? And so the first chapter of the book is dedicated to that question. The rest of it's going to be, on topic, actually explaining what the fundamentals are. But the first chapter explains basically why believe in biblical historical Christianity. And this is a topic that has been of considerable interest to me, in that Christian apologetics, and especially Protestant, evangelical, Pentecostal apologetics, doesn't tend to be very strong in this area. Now, that is, why is it that we're not traditional Christians? Why aren't we Catholic? Why aren't we Eastern Orthodox? And at the same time, why don't we go to the other side of the spectrum and become a non-Trinitarian or restorational group, like, say, the different various forms of Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or something like that? Why is it that Protestants are not at one side or the other on this kind of thing? What is it that creates this worldview? And granted, I can't speak for everyone as to why they become a Protestant or not. I think there are some people, just born and raised in it. I think would be a lot of it. They're cultural Protestants, if you will. Just like there are people who are cultural Catholics, cultural Orthodox, as well as cultural Mormons and cultural Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're raised in it, that is typically what you're going to wind up believing. And then there's people who proselytize for various reasons and proselytize all over the place. There's no one group that never has any people who leave it. At least not that I know of. I've known of people who were Assemblies of God, which is the particular denomination that I belong to, who have on one hand converted to Mormonism, and on the other hand converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. So it's not like there's never ever any leaving from one side to the other, that kind of thing. And so most people's motivations I probably can't speak to. I'm not most people. But I can at least give an accounting for why I believe what I believe, and that's what I sought to do in Principles, giving it the title of Biblical Historical Christianity as a subset under Protestantism. And, there's lots of things you could talk about for why I'm not a traditional Christian and those kinds of things, but ultimately I found that it comes down to three major areas. Things that, frankly, I just simply cannot get past. And these are things that prevent me from going from one extreme to the next. As long as I accept these three things and believe these three things, I'm not going to be a traditional Christian, and I'm also not going to be a restorational or a non-Trinitarian Christian. These are things that, since I believe them, it prevents me from going from one side to the other. And there are also things that tend to be really irksome to people at the ends, and also, ironically, it's also irksome to some Protestants as well. But hopefully when I explain them, it'll make sense. The first thing that I believe in that makes it so that, frankly, there is no way I could accept traditional Christianity is the principle of the fallibility of mankind. That is, nobody's perfect. And frankly, I don't think most people would assume that they're perfect or try to pretend otherwise. I mean, there's a few people that are going to, but most of the time we would call them crazy and be justified in doing so. People know that they're not perfect. It doesn't really need a whole lot of explanation. Now, that's something, like I said, it's basically axiomatic for most people, but how does that relate to Christianity? Well, very simply. Traditional groups, at least most of them that I've investigated, especially Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm not exactly sure what the Assyrian Church's point of view is on these issues, or what the Oriental Orthodox point of view is. But I know that at least for Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, they claim that the Church is infallible, and that various components of it are also infallible. My problem with that is very straightforward. The Church is made of people. The various offices that are held within the Church are held by people. The various things that the Church does, whether it be synods or councils or whatever, are things in which there is human participation. And granted, to a certain extent, you could argue that the combined whole helps to prevent certain problems. That is, if you have multiple things involved, there's some redundancy there, some checks and balances that help prevent things from going off the deep end too far. But the problem that I have is that if you have fallible components, there is no way to get something that's infallible out of it aside from invoking a miracle. And that's essentially what the traditional groups have to claim, is that by some divine providence, despite being made up of fallible people, their system is somehow infallible. Their church is somehow infallible. Their leader, if you're talking about Catholics with the Pope, is somehow infallible when he speaks ex cathedra. I don't know why he would be infallible then and not the other times. It seems like if you're fallible in one case, you'd be fallible in any other case, by principle of induction. But this is something that, frankly, I cannot get past. People aren't perfect. And so to say that your system or your group is somehow perfect, even though you yourselves are not, obviously, seems to me like a contradiction in terms. It seems like something that you'd want to believe. And most people like that absolute assurance that, we're right, we're true. We are the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. If you're a traditional Christian, or if you're a non-traditional Christian who's more on the restorational or non-Trinitarian side, I might say we are the one true Church of Jesus Christ, of Latter-day Saints, and things like that. People like absolutes, but the reality of the human condition is that we're not perfect. And because of that, absolutes are a luxury that we usually do not have. There is no guarantee that I or anybody else am absolutely correct regarding our doctrine and theology. There are things that we can definitely say are most probably wrong and most probably right. But to be absolute about it is, as far as a strict absolute sense of truth is concerned, is a very difficult thing to do. And it becomes to the point where it's simply an affirmation, and it's not something that you could really prove in any definitive way. And this is something that becomes a problem for traditional Christians, in that there are multiple traditional Christian groups, whether it be the Catholics or the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox, the Assyrian Church, whatever. If you're claiming that you're the one true group and everybody else is claiming that they're the one true group, well, then obviously someone is lying. Or perhaps everyone is lying. And I tend to side more with everyone is lying. It's just that fundamental problem of the fallibility of the human condition. It's almost like the traditional Christians are saying, we who are infallible are somehow infallible. And they wave the hand. These are not the droids you're looking for, and these kinds of things. It just doesn't make any sense on that one. So I believe in the fallibility of mankind, which means that nothing in which there is human participation can somehow be infallible. And as long as the traditional Christian groups are claiming this, and as long as a lot of the non-traditional and non-Trinitarian groups are claiming this, that their group is the one true group, infallibly so, or at least functionally infallibly so, even if they don't necessarily call it that. I'm not going to be accepting it. It keeps me from either end of the spectrum. So that would be the first major problem that I have with traditional groups, and also with the groups that are on the other side. Second principle that I accept is that of ad fontes. Ad fontes is a Latin phrase meaning to the sources, and I've talked about it before in conversations that I've had, especially with the Eastern Orthodox. But it is actually the principle that historically kind of gave rise to sola scriptura as we now know it. That is, the Renaissance humanists, and that is people who were studying the humanities. Humanist then does not mean what it means now. Basically people who were studying the humanities, like history and epistemology and ethics and those kinds of things. They believed in going back to the sources. And that's what the phrase means, ad fontes, back to the sources, to the sources. And the idea being that what we have now and what we accept now and what we understand now could possibly be wrong. That is, if you accept the first principle that mankind is fallible, then that means that our current understanding is also fallible. We might not have everything right. So when it comes to something that is a historical question, a historical issue, it makes sense to go back to the beginning and actually see what was first believed. And this is where the principle of sola scriptura comes from. That is, if you accept that Christian tradition and the final iteration of things can get things wrong, that people along down the line can add to the original understanding, they can alter the original understanding, they can sometimes completely misunderstand what was originally given. If you accept that as being a possibility, not necessarily that it happens in every case, or even most of the cases, and certainly not in a lot of major issues. For example, Protestants and traditional Christians still agree on a number of issues, the Trinity being one of the major ones that we agree on, whereas the non-Trinitarians and the Restorationists, not always so much. In fact, a lot of the main groups that we think of that are in that category, especially the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, definitely don't agree on those issues. That is, Protestants don't assume that traditional Christianity got every single thing wrong, but rather they're open to the possibility that mankind is fallible, and because of that, using the final iteration of things, using things as we've accepted them to be, and even 400 years after the fact, might not be the best standard. Instead, it behooves one to go back to the first sources and go from there. And this is something that you would do with any other historical question. If you wanted to know about a particular figure in history, you're going to pick the sources that are both the earliest and also the most reliable. And you're going to base most of your understanding on that. That doesn't mean you won't use sources that come later, and it doesn't mean that you aren't going to consider some of the less reliable sources. But the bulk of your understanding is going to be based on those early, reliable sources. And the same thing applies in Protestantism. A lot of people falsely get the idea, and frankly it bugs me to death when people do this, that Protestantism is about using the Bible instead of tradition. That actually isn't true. I don't think that you could really historically justify that, and just as far as the development of the concept itself, I don't think that it's really justifiable. And especially if you've studied your history at all, you would know that the Bible, that Scripture, is technically a tradition, like the rest of tradition. That is, tradition in the most basic sense is simply that which is passed on, that which is given over from one person or group or generation to the next. The problem in Protestantism is the fallibility of mankind, that as time goes on, errors are more and more likely to start accumulating, that things are going to start being attached to things are going to be altered, misunderstandings are going to start happening. And so it's not a matter of Bible versus tradition, it's a matter of what eventually has come down to us versus what was originally given. And if you're going to talk about what was originally given in history, ad fontes is the standard, to the sources. You want those sources that are both earliest and most reliable. And when it comes to Christianity, the set of documents that are both the earliest and the most reliable, the most authoritative, is canonical scripture, is the Bible. And there's a reason why Protestants don't accept all of the books that traditional Christians do. Of course, traditional Christians don't agree with each other on the books of the Bible either, so it's not like you can necessarily fault us for that one. We all disagree with each other. Nice. But Protestants are definitely a lot pickier because they want things that are both early and things that are authoritative, things that are the most reliable that they can be, and there are certain books that just are not, for whatever reason that happens to be. This doesn't mean that they don't have a use. You can look through a lot of the early Protestant stuff when they were talking about these things, and they didn't necessarily feel that these books should necessarily be outright forbidden or anything like that. It was just that they weren't useful for the establishment of doctrine, which is something that the ancient church fathers agreed with, like Rufinus and Athanasius, and Cyril definitely did. He actually called the entire lot of them apocryphal, unreliable, or untrue. But that was the mindset early on, is that there are other books that you can attach to the Bible and use them in your church services and read from them even. And it's good to have new Christians go through them and these kinds of things. There are appropriate uses for these writings. However, as far as using them for the core basis of doctrine and theology, not so much. And that is the view that I would hold as well. It's not that I'm necessarily for or against those books, but just simply understanding that they're not as reliable as the others. And that is the main issue, is going back to those sources that are earliest, most reliable, and that's where we wind up with Sola Scriptura. Sola Scriptura is not a necessarily Bible-derived doctrine, and if it was, you would actually have the problem of circular reasoning. That is, I trust this book because it told me to. I don't know that that's really a good plan. That seems kind of like the definition of insanity, or pretty close to it. Now, I do believe that the Bible, a fair reading of the Bible, would lead you to believing that Scripture is to be trusted over other forms of authority that you could have within Christianity. I do think that it could be biblically derived. I just don't believe that it's necessarily biblically derived. That is, I think that there is a logical component to it that we would accept on a simple historical basis. If you want to talk about something that happened in history and you want to check things out, and if you're not convinced that the final form of something should be your final authority, going back to the beginning, to those first most reliable sources, is what you do when it comes to those kinds of historical questions. It's not a matter of Bible versus tradition. It's a matter of going back to the beginning instead of accepting what has come down. And this is something that really irritates a lot of people, even within Protestantism, unfortunately, and that if your standard is first things first, then that also has a bearing upon what the particular makeup of Scripture is going to be. That is, it's not just a matter of books, of which books are most reliable and whatnot, but it also has to do with the form. That is, as you go through history, you'll notice this progression that happens, where there are additions and alterations and misunderstandings that happen in Scripture, in the scriptural record, and you'll notice there are things that are changed. For example, in the New Testament alone, mostly Protestants have gone through and looked at the New Testament material and found that the traditional forms of the New Testament that are commonly accepted in traditional Christianity today, and especially Eastern Orthodoxy, include up to 33 passages that very well may not have been authentic. And in fact, a good many of them probably weren't. Now, as a Protestant, that frankly justifies my position. Mankind is fallible. The institution, therefore, cannot be infallible because it's made up of men which are fallible and they get things wrong. They do wind up adding to their original understanding things that were not original at all. They do wind up altering what was originally there, and they do wind up misunderstanding things, sometimes very much so. And this is the progression that we see in Scripture as you go through history. Now, does that necessarily make my faith in Scripture invalidated? No, because my standard is still first things first. And based on your best understanding of what is first, you draw your conclusions from there. Now, if you'll listen to that carefully, what that does mean, though, is that our position on things can change. That is, in light of new evidence, our position about things very well may change with regard to some of those textual variants and any of the doctrine and theology that are attached to them. In most cases, there really isn't a lot of doctrine and theology that is attached to it. It's usually very localized to that particular passage, and there's usually multiple passages in the Bible that talk about the similar things, so on and so forth. And so it doesn't have a great bearing on Protestant doctrine and theology in that sense. But there is still that possibility that I could be wrong. And that is something that I'm willing to accept. I don't have to be right. Given new information, provided it's compelling new information, that would contradict what I believe now, I can accept that I should change. This is something that traditional Christians cannot do because they, by definition, assume themselves to be infallible. All of the evidence in the world isn't going to change their mind about anything. And the same thing with people that are on the other side, the non-Trinitarian and restorational groups. Ironically, even though they freely admit that the groups that came before them were fallible, there's a reason why they're not Catholic, there's a reason why they're not Eastern Orthodox, they think that those groups are fallible, they somehow make themselves out to be fallible, and they don't allow for new evidence. They don't allow that they could have gotten things wrong, and perhaps completely so, which is what I would argue in the case of, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons. Well, maybe not completely wrong with regard to every detail, but certainly a lot of the substantial beliefs, I think they're not out there and loony. But that is the question that we have here. Is it an evidence-based decision, or is it essentially a tradition and dogma-based decision? And frankly, these things always play into Protestantism. All Protestant groups, whether they like to admit it or not, are going to have their own traditions and dogmas. And frankly, I think it's one of the greatest limitations that we have in Christianity in general, but especially in modern Protestantism, is that despite how much the word tradition just makes Protestants' hair stand up, and just irks us to no end, the fact of the matter is that we can be very traditional. So much so that we don't actually take a good hard look at what we believe and be willing to change in light of new evidence. Frankly, the study that I've done has made me, in a lot of ways, a more traditional Christian than most other Protestants would be in a great many respects. I don't believe, for example, that the Lord's Supper is merely a commemoration. It is a commemoration, to be sure, but looking at the scriptural record and the early Christian record, even if you don't necessarily accept transubstantiation and these kinds of things, which I don't, there is still the sense of participation that is there, that is deeply embedded in the early Christian psyche that you can't ignore. Now, whether or not you want to formally call it transubstantiation and all of these kinds of things and create this entire, system of theology around it, which I think is a little bit overkill, the one thing that you can definitely say is that it's more important than just mere commemoration easily. And frankly, that separates me from a lot of Protestants. In fact, in my church recently, I gave a sermon on the subject of communion, on the subject of the Eucharist. And frankly, it wasn't a traditional communion kind of sermon, because I did bring up a lot of the historical factors and a lot of these kinds of things and saying, we should probably take it a lot more seriously than we do. And I think it's good for us to be willing to challenge our preconceptions about things. In traditional Christianity, I can't do that. I could question Protestantism in coming to traditional Christianity, but within traditional Christianity, frankly, I wouldn't have a lot of freedom to question those kinds of things and say that question, what if we got things wrong? What about these first sources that don't quite match up with what comes later? Or the understanding doesn't quite seem to be the same. I mean, yes, you can go back to some of the early church fathers that talk about, say, baptismal regeneration and these kinds of things. And in light of the broader historical context, I'm not necessarily convinced that what they meant by baptismal regeneration is what traditional Christians have come to accept that it means. I can see that there's definitely a much greater emphasis that's placed on it in early Christianity than you find in a lot of Protestant groups, and a lot of evangelical groups in particular, unfortunately. But to say that it necessarily has to be the traditional viewpoint is something that I don't agree with. Yes, a lot of the early church fathers talk about it, but I'm just not convinced that they're talking about it in the same way. These kinds of things. And that all has to go back to the beginning and being willing to challenge your own traditions and your own dogmatizations. And like I said, at either end of the spectrum, I couldn't do that. I mean, if you're Eastern Orthodox, you're Eastern Orthodox. If you're Catholic, you're Catholic. If you're Mormon, you're Mormon. If you're Jehovah's Witness, you're a Jehovah's Witness. And that freedom to question isn't really there, at least as much as I would like it to be. And so that's part of the reason why I am a biblical historical Christian, why I'm a Protestant, and I'm not at either one of those spectrums. And of course, this idea of going back to the beginning and being able to correct yourself based on the information that you find there leads to the third thing that I would say distinguishes myself as a Protestant from traditional groups or restorational non-Trinitarian groups, and that is the concept of falsifiability. That whole question of what if you're wrong, how would you know? How could you establish a basis? Traditional groups deny that they're falsifiable by definition. That is, there is no functional way within the traditional mindset to prove that it's false. How would you know? Within my worldview, as a biblical historical Christian, there is a way to prove that it's false. You go back to the earliest sources, especially to Scripture, because it is the first most authoritative source in Christianity, and show me where I'm wrong, and shut my mouth. And I've had people who've done that before, within Protestantism and also within Eastern Orthodoxy and within Roman Catholicism, I admit. There are some things that I've just completely neglected, didn't even think about, and they've pointed them out. And I have to admit, yeah, I was wrong. There's a standard, it's sitting right there in front of me, that shows me that I was wrong. I'm falsifiable. My belief system is falsifiable. But in those other systems, they are typically not open to falsification. That is, how would you know that it's wrong in any meaningful way? They never come up with something that allows for any kind of a change, that allows the view to really be questioned in any real way. And the same thing goes for the other end of the spectrum, not just the traditional side, but also for the non-Trinitarian and restorational groups. How is it that you prove that Joseph Smith was not a prophet within Mormonism? Would they accept any kind of proof to the contrary? And I mean, if you do accept proof to the contrary, and if you even accept the questioning thereof, frankly, you're probably not going to remain a Mormon for very long. Just to be honest, to be blunt. That whole issue of falsifiability, of anchoring oneself to something that can be proven and fairly tangible, fairly absolute, not completely absolute because we're fallible humans, we're never going to know things perfectly, but in a fairly rigorous way, is something that a lot of these groups on either side of the spectrum really don't like to do. I mean, there's a reason why in Mormonism they don't say, go back to the beginning. Instead, they say, we had a restoration now that revealed all of these things to us. which frankly isn't something that's falsifiable. I can say, I reveal, something was revealed to me now, and it said that all y'all are wrong, and really we should be following the flying spaghetti monster in the sky, and these kinds of things. There is really there's no accountability there. There's no falsifiability there. And of course, once you deny falsifiability and detach yourself from a means of accountability, well, there's no stopping it. And this is exactly what's happened in Mormonism. You have offshoot groups that have now started to spring up that claiming that they're the restoration of the restoration, essentially. And you get Archie Wood's True Gnostic Church, and you get Christopher Nemelka's group. I forget what... Actually, I don't know if I ever figured out formally what they call themselves, but you get Christopher Nemelka's group that claims basically to be a restoration of the restoration, and so does Archie Wood's group, and these kinds of things. And that's the problem. If there is no accountability, if there is no falsifiability that's actually built into the system, it goes off into all kinds of weirdness. So, this is what would prevent me from going to those kinds of things, because there's nothing to keep me from creating my own version of it if I wanted to. This is what God revealed to me. There's no kind of accountability there. No falsifiability that actually is meaningful. So basically that's the reason why I'm a Protestant, and I'm not either a traditional Christian nor a restorationist or a non-Trinitarian. I'm in the middle. Why? Because I believe that mankind is fallible. So if you're going to claim that your group is infallible in any kind of way, to any office or extent thereof, frankly, I'm not going to believe you. I know myself. I know I'm fallible. And by induction, I can pretty reasonably infer that you are also fallible, and that all of you together, as many checks and balances as there may be, will still be infallible. And so I'm not going to accept that. People are fallible. It's just the way it is. Another reason why I'm Protestant is because I do accept the principle of ad fontes. If you want to investigate something historically, you go back to the earliest, most reliable sources, and you start there. That's why I'm a sola scriptura Christian. Do I believe that doctrine could be justified from Scripture? Yes. But necessarily so? No. That's how you investigate anything that's a historical question, is you go back to the earliest, most reliable sources. And also, I want there to be a system of falsifiability. Something that is beyond mere feeling, and something that actually does hold people reasonably accountable. And where you could justifiably say, you saying that you got this special revelation and went off into Nana land isn't correct. And these kinds of things. This is why I'm a Protestant, and why I'm not a traditional Christian, and why I'm not on the other side of the aisle either. I'm in the middle. And frankly, I think that is the best place to be in this case. There are things that in Christianity I am very absolute about. There are things that Christianity has always been definitive on. And I don't think we should ever change our views on those things. But at the same time, it is still wise to avoid extremes. And that's, to a certain extent, why I am the way that I am. And also why I don't wind up being a very normal Protestant either. But anyways, hopefully this has been something that's helped you guys think about these things and maybe understand where I'm coming from a little bit, and also help you consider your own viewpoint on these things. And you probably, if you're a traditional Christian, or if you're a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or something like that, you'll probably won't agree with a lot of the things that I said. You won't have that viewpoint. You won't say, well, that's not how we view it. We view it like this, that, and the other, and whatever. But at least this provides an opportunity for conversation, and an opportunity for people to think about these things a little bit more deeply. So, that being said, go with God and be blessed. Thank you much.